Hey there, magical experimenters. This is Taylor Ellwood, and I am so excited today because I have the fabulous, amazing Rich Kiska with me. Before we start the interview, I just want to do a brief shout out to Jillian Mage, who connected me and Rich together. She basically said, hey, you should interview this amazing, awesome person. And it's funny because I already knew Rich. I should have thought of it myself, but hey, sometimes you need a little help. And Jillian, so thank you very much. So Rich, please introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about you and where we can find you on the web, and then let's explore the mechanics of magical experimentation.
I am Rich Kiska. I am an energy healer, an interdimensional ambassador, and a sin eater. I work with clients individually to rearrange their energy. Essentially, I access their subconscious, rearrange the furniture, and get results. You can find me on deepintheheartofhexes.com or here on Facebook under Rich Kiska.
Love it. Deep in the heart of Hexus. I love that. That's so cool. So, one of the things that I've been, you always are posting interesting things and doing interesting experiments. I mean, I love your magical entity experiments, and you have this awesome flow chart. I referred to it in my Walking with Magical Entities book because I thought it was really cool and it was such an interesting idea. So let's talk a little bit about how you got into magical experimentation and magic in general, and then kind of start exploring the mechanics.
Well, I kind of came up traditionally, like most people do. You get a library card when you're a little kid, you immediately run to the Greek myths, the Egyptian myths, and the occult section and start doing tarot cards and all of that kind of stuff. But I always kind of felt a little lost and displaced within my practice for a long time. It was hard to figure out exactly what I was supposed to be doing. You'll get like a book, it'll have spells in it, but they don't quite ring the bell. And like something's off, but maybe you don't know why. So at the same time, I was, searching, always searching and doing a lot of yoga. And I had this sort of incredibly traumatic and violent spiritual awakening that essentially melted my brain. And when I came out of that, it was like everything had just been opened up and knocked out of place. And suddenly, all of this stuff made a tremendous amount of sense to me. And I just took off running. And when I was in that early stages of that, you were actually a huge influence because you were doing a lot of emphasis on pop magic in particular. And I remember thinking, like, wait a minute. If we can do that, what can't we do? And then I started branching into areas of territory that I really never thought that I would end up in because, one of the areas of a culture that I get critical of is that it can be very fixed. The range of topics is fixed, the information is fixed, and anything outside of that can get like laughed at or poo-pooed. And so I never thought I'd be somebody who would be using words like interdimensional or talking about like space jellyfish or like whatever, but I kind of made that leap into other areas and it all just sort of started tying together. I started thinking about the collective unconscious, the astral realm, how we interact in between the material and the astral, and where magic actually happens because it has to happen somewhere. There's like a point where you have the thought and the thought connects with a thing. And to me, I think that's really where all the juice is.
I would agree with that. Well, I want to just say thank you for any influence I had in your spiritual path. Thank you for acknowledging that. I'm honored. I mean, it's always cool when I get to talk to somebody who says that. And I'm like you in that I've never really stuck with a conventional path. Like you, I found that like the spell books and stuff, there was something off. There's something missing. I kind of think of it as they're very prescriptive. There's not a lot of solid explanation as to why you're doing what you're doing, or it's just kind of like, well, go and do this and do that, and maybe a fairy will appear or something else. Well, okay, and then what? So that's always an interesting thing, and I think like you, it is good to step outside of the fixed conventional disciplines of magic. So what's one of the disciplines that you find that you're drawing on? And you might not even call it a discipline. I mean, that's just me using that word. But what is one of the areas of study that you've drawn on that you wouldn't that doesn't necessarily fit the typical occult structures, but nonetheless is something people ought to look into?
I would have to say it's really spirit model. You know, a lot of a culture is defined around your relationship with what I call non-corporeal entities, things that have no body. And we tend to sort of like venerate them and worship and spend a lot of time, talking about like correct practices and how to interact with these entities. And, you know, I was reading something somebody posted the other day, this really long-winded thing, and at the end it was just like, and this is why you need to be nice to your spirits. And I was like, bro, you really took me through all that just to tell me to like, suck up? Like, come on. So I really started looking at these entities from a very different point of view, which is, we made them. They're a reflection of our collective unconscious. We feed into them. We give them power just to try to borrow it back through like begging and scraping and making deals. Why would I do that? Why would I give somebody something just to ask for it back? Why don't I just use it in the first place? And so that combined with a lot of entity contact, that's, one of the cornerstones of my practice, and realizing that you never really know who you're talking to. You don't have any idea what their motivations are. And we kind of really undermine the fact that they need us almost more than we need them, because they don't have bodies. They can't do anything. They can't build anything. They can't create anything without us. And just as well, like we rely on them for that connection into the collective unconscious, where we draw inspiration and ideas and give form to things. And so it's really all about that relationship between concept and form, back and forth. And I don't necessarily think that that needs to happen from a position of supplication, submission, worship, or anything like that.
That's a really interesting perspective. I totally agree with it from the notion that really they do need us just as much, if not more, than we need them, because they don't have material form. And I think it's interesting because a lot of times people will, I think they'll take one of two approaches. They'll either take the approach of supplication or worship, or they'll take the opposite approach of, I'm going to go in and I'm going to dominate them and I'm going to force them to do what I want. And that kind of speaks to your point. Like, why are we having to take back the power if the power is already there? And what would it look like even to enter into a relationship with them that didn't have a power dynamic, but instead maybe just a mutual acknowledgement of, here's how I can help you and here's how you can help me. Let's help each other. Instead of making it into a power dynamic, why not make it into a collaborative dynamic?
Sure. And the yogic point of view is that all is connected, all is one. And because these entities exist as a creation of the collective unconscious, they are an extension of you already. You're interacting with a facet of the self. Granted, it's an incredibly abstracted and fractalized version of the self, because, this entity maybe existed before you, maybe exists after you. That's where time gets very bendy. We won't go there.
I'm willing to go there if you are.
But you know what I mean? Like, so it's just a part of you, but it's also not. I don't know. I just think it needs to be approached from a totally different angle. And, one of the things I've noticed is that once I abandoned that model, that need, that particular over under, you're either over them or under them dynamic, like my magic is highly functional. I get results every single day. I work on people every day. And it becomes to a point where you're like, oh, maybe we took some of the mystical part of it, the woo, but not really, because now it actually just works, which is exciting in its own way.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I want to return to the time thing because I think it's interesting, and because we were actually talking about it a little bit before we started recording the show. And I mean, I think that there is something interesting to be said about taking that yogic perspective, for example, that we're really in everything. Like, we never really go away. I mean, we transform, we change, we're not going to necessarily have this physical vessel forever, but that doesn't mean we're not going to be around. It just means that the nature of our relationship with things will change. And so it's an interesting notion then, because if we're one with everything, then we are really interacting with ourselves throughout time and space. in a variety of ways that perhaps we're just denying to ourselves, we're limiting ourselves because we're letting ourselves get limited by the by the manifestation of taking on a body. I mean, there's something very powerful about taking on a body, actually. I will say that, because you can do stuff with the body that you couldn't do as a spirit. But as a spirit, you can be everywhere and everyone at once.
Yeah. So my theory is that you can have both. You can actually, once you learn how to really tap into that collective unconscious space, pretty much at will, you can have that back and forth dynamic kind of constantly. Like I joke around all the time that, this is my vacation house. This is where, I pop into this body to like do stuff, but a good chunk of the time, like I'm not really here. I'm kind of somewhere else. And being able to shift back and forth between the two has been, a pretty fabulous experience. And it's not as daunting or difficult, I think, as people make it out to be. When
Mhm.
we were talking before the show about, these little time bendy things, one of the things I wanted to ask you was, how do you like, what are the mechanics of making that time bending happen? Because you talked about how I could theoretically go back in time to my former self and act as a guide to that self. What does the mechanics of that look like to you? How do you accomplish that?
So I think there's a couple different ways that you can approach it. The one I'm going to give two different ways. The one way I'm going to give is what I would recommend to someone just starting out, because I think sometimes you have to have certain tools in place. So I would take like a picture of your younger self, for example. You can connect to that picture simply by looking at it, and you can connect to that experience in that moment. What was that younger you feeling right then and there? What was that younger you experiencing? What were they thinking? What were the life experiences that were going on? What is it you wish you could have told them? What is it you wish you could do for them? And then you go in and you connect with that consciousness, because really you are that consciousness. You are there with them. You're present in every single moment of space and time that you exist in. But what you do is you share your particular frame of reference. That's where you bring the linear in. So the nonlinear is we're present in every single moment, but the linear is let's apply the particular frame of reference that we have to that actual experience and say, here, I'm going to download this information to you so that I can help you get to where I am. Or a future version of yourself could do the same thing. I mean, I had an interaction this summer where basically my future self basically did just that. And that's where we get into the more advanced version of this, because if we take the notion of we're present in every single moment in time, then we always have access to all versions of ourselves, sideways, diagonally, up and down if we're using directional things, or whatever. And again, these are just frames of reference. They're very convenient, but they also are an example of our human interaction in this particular case. But if we're really in touch with all these different moments of time, then we can actually commune with any of them at any point that we need to, and we can have that information by osmosis. And then afterwards, we may not even realize. Like in my case, it was the information by osmosis was what got me through a very difficult summer and basically brought me to the place that I'm living now, and the people that are manifesting in my life. So, I mean, it's something where really you can be tapped into that. A picture just becomes a very useful frame of reference, especially when you're starting out, if you need some type of visual aid. Or you could use something if you have like I have an old wooden box from my childhood. I still have. I have it so I could use that old wooden box to connect with my 7-year-old self, for example. But if you don't, once you'll eventually outgrow that need for frame of reference and simply realize I am present in all of these different moments, and I can bring them all together into one moment and then fold them back out again and again, speaking to what you were saying earlier.
Yeah, like that fractalizing, like I'm this, but I'm that, but I'm that, but I'm that, and then back down and back forward. And it's kind of funny because this topic comes up for me a lot because people will come to me for various energy shifting things. And one of the questions I get a lot is, can we do a past life reading? And I'm always just like, which one? They're all yours. Like, they're all yours. Every past life, every future life, all of the lives, they're all yours. So it's more like tuning into a radio station or watching a channel or whatever, once you tune into that like conceptual space and you get really familiar with it, you can kind of tune into anything, not just your own past self in this material world, but any past self, anything really. Pretty big, vast space out there.
Well, yeah, as an example, we can tune into each other right now and tune into those moments, because in a very real sense, we're present in each other's lives. I mean, this could be the first example of you and I interacting physically in this way, but that doesn't mean we haven't interacted, and it doesn't mean we couldn't interact. And we could even change it and say that and set it up in such a way where in a theoretical sense, we interacted with each other and physically in a different way at a different point in time, as an example. Right. So there's possibilities.
Sure. And one of the ways that I do this, back to the mechanics of it, like how I actually accomplish this is so, okay, we've got like our mental connection going, like I know who you are, you know who I am. And that means that we're automatically connected just through recognition. Because, like a lot of times when people ask me to do like work on someone, they'll be like, do you need to know anything about them? And I said, no, because you know about them. And I've just connected to you. You're connected to them. I can get to them through you. Doesn't matter. But the mechanics of how I do it is I actually have I didn't bring it with me. I have a book that has like a list of words and phrases, and I just use divination to drive me to the right words, to the right phrases that tells me what's going on, like with my client or with myself, or, like after we get off this, I realized I should have done a session for you before we did this. So I'm going to do one afterward.
All right.
You can see like how it works, but, yeah, basically it's just me talking to your subconscious and asking it questions, and you are answering me back through this list of words, these prompts. And then I can kind of like paint a picture of what's going on with you and then actually like move the blockages. One of my main working definitions of magic is it's just moving energy from one place to another with intention. And so you can do that with somebody's interior, which is essentially, when we talk about love spells or curses, or that's all we're really doing. We're just moving chunks of energy around to either create or remove obstructions within another being.
Yeah, or alignment in a way, like we're aligning. Yeah, that's a really good way to look at it. I like that. And it's a very clever use of words and magic as well. I mean, I think that words are very powerful. It's a medium that we all interact with, we connect with. So that's a very innovative and interesting way to approach it. How did you come up with that process? Was it just something where you just, like you found it somewhere, or was it something where it was like one day it just came to you and you're like, hey, I came up with this?
Oh, heck no, I am not responsible for this. What's funny is almost all of the tech that I'm currently using is from a Mormon faith healer.
Huh.
One of the byproducts of that violent spiritual awakening that I had was I developed a really, really serious headache for about a year solid, where I was just in constant pain, and I was going to doctors and, getting MRIs, and I have a blood clot in the back of my head. It's like that big. So understandably, while I'm like home and trapped on the couch, they're not letting me do anything because nobody knows if I'm going to blow a gasket. I got a little bit depressed, and I looked up local therapists. Turns out there's a lady who lives a half a mile from my house, has lived down the road from me for 20 years. And she is a therapist, and she kind of branches out into the woo. And so there's this technique called the emotion code or the body code that she uses in conjunction with traditional therapy. And she sucked that headache out of my head in 3 months.
Wow.
Yeah. And I was like, this is nuts. Like, I had never seen anything like what she was doing. I liked it. And then after my headache was gone, we decided to just keep working. And then eventually she was like, you should really try this. Because I would talk to her about, occult stuff and yoga and all that stuff all the time. And so I took the certification, which, I don't really, I don't really recommend doing, like really expensive classes. I'm not a huge fan of, but it was worth getting this particular set of information. Once I realized how it worked mechanically, I was like, holy crap, we could apply this to anything, absolutely anything. And so I just took the tech and ran.
And I can see that because I mean, an example that I can think of is the entity flow chart that you shared.
Yeah.
And what you've done with viral entities. Can you speak to that a bit? Because it's really fascinating, and it was something that I loved seeing, and it was like, wow, this is so cool. It was such an interesting take on working with entities.
Well, so, we talk about servitors. Servitors are essentially like simple, sometimes single, but simple function. I kind of almost think of them like an app, like on a computer, which is where I came up with the flowchart idea. But it's technically like an entity, a thought form that provides a singular or simple function, and you can kind of like annex part of your brain to do this thing. I had actually accidentally built one like 25 years ago for thrift stores, where I get like a little tingle in the back of my mind when I should be off hunting for something, or conversely, I could put in a request and within a week or two, that object will show up in my hands. This was really cool. So after I learned this emotion code technique, which uses also something called transcranial stimulation, transcranial magnetic stimulation, use magnet. Once I started doing that, I was like, wait a minute. Okay, anything we're doing here, we can build conceptually in the astral dimension. Like, why couldn't I build these servitors? And I started doing them because mostly out of necessity. A lot of what the practices that I was doing is called emotional releases, where you target certain emotions and you release them. I can't do the kind of maintenance that people need. They would need to be seen once a week. They would need to be seen like regularly. So I was like, what if I made a bot, like a little Roomba, a Roomba that would show up at my client, at an appointed time and suck out whatever emotions are ready to go and then go back to its dock and do it again. And it worked.
Yeah.
Holy crap. And so from there, I just started like really kind of geeking out. And I was like, okay, well, what if I wanted to attach one of these to everyone on the planet? And I was like, okay, well, how would I get it to attach from one person to another? What's the most contagious thing? And it was interesting because I was coming up with these ideas right at the start of the pandemic, when we're all just thinking about like how viruses transmit. And I ended up doing it through emotional contact. So anyone you've ever had emotional contact with was now getting a replicated servitor attached to them, which would then replicate and attach to anyone that they had had emotional contact with. And I think I had 8 billion of them generated in 3 months. That's
Yeah,
how fast.
well, yeah, and it makes sense because I mean, really, it's and yeah, the pandemic was great for inspiring certain things in some ways, right? I mean, it's why not take that and work with it? I mean, that's a good example right there, and like, and it's a very interesting approach to working with entities. So when we look at the mechanics of magic, I think that one thing that fascinates me with your approach is that it's very clear to me that you are taking a very different angle on things. And I've always noticed that with your work. I've found it fascinating. What would you say to somebody who maybe is trapped and mired in the typical static structures, the ceremonial magic, the chaos magic, all the other structures? And I'm going to throw chaos magic under the bus here because at this point it is pretty static. Let's just call it for what it is.
Oh yeah, I would agree with you 100%. It's become prescriptive, and that's where I met you. We met in those circles. Like that's kind of where I really kind of came up through the occult culture, like as a more cohesive entity, not just as a solitary practitioner. When I used to make art. Sometimes I still do. And when I was really serious about it, I used to do very narrative art, which is prescriptive. And I was frustrated and I was talking to my best friend and I was like, what should I do? I don't know how to stop doing this. And he gave me the most obnoxious advice, and it was so correct. And he goes, just do the opposite of whatever you're doing. Like whatever decision you would make, do the exact opposite. And I ended up within a year churning out like a couple hundred pieces of abstract art. Like I was just making one after the other, because it was the opposite of what I was doing before, which was like labor intensive, detail oriented, linear, and narrative work. And I kind of just decided to take the same approach to magic. I got obsessed with a single idea, which is, where does the magic happen? What can I get rid of? Can I get rid of this candle? Can I get rid of an incantation? Do I actually need an entity to do this? How far can I strip this down and still have it work? And it kind of led me back to the natural thing that I came up with, which was yoga. Yogis are one of the oldest living magical traditions on the planet that is still intact, like almost completely.
Mhm.
And it is completely self-reliant. It is all about turning inwards into that, like that metaverse that we were talking about, where you are everything and everything is you. And then once you catch that wave, you can move it all around. And
Yeah,
that was really where it came from.
that makes sense. It's interesting because I've taken a similar minimalistic approach. And then what I've, where I kind of had a point, I was like, all right, it was in my early 20s. It was like, why am I doing these elaborate ceremonial rituals? Like I had the sword, the dagger, all this other stuff. And I'm like, why am I doing these things? Like, who tells me that this is essential? And why is it essential? And I started to really question that and examine it. And then I was like, is there a way to take this stuff and bring it inside and make it part of me? And there was. I read this book by William G. Gray called Magical Ritual Methods. The irony of it being that this was a guy who was famed for doing elaborate rituals, like very tedious, boring rituals. But in this book, he did write about like how you could become the rod, you could become the wand, whatever. And I thought that was interesting. So I took that and ran with it. But then I started to really explore it from the perspective then too of like, okay, if I strip everything away, if there's anything I could bring back in, or if I could change it, what would I do? And so then I started to bring certain things back, and I'm like, but I'm going to bring them back for only as long as it takes to help me get to the point where I don't need them, which goes back to our early conversation about having a frame of reference, where sometimes you need that frame of reference initially, because it grounds you. But at a certain point, you can step away from it and let it go. Because if you've mastered it and understood it, then like you said, with the yogis, it takes you to that place where like you can be anywhere and everywhere. And I think it's a very it's an approach to magic that definitely pushes people outside of their safety zone, because at a certain point you come to the realization, well, how much of any of this is really essential? There's an existential crisis there in the making.
Yeah. And that's like my happy place right there. That's standing on the precipice and looking down and going, holy shit, what is that? Or like experiencing everything and nothing at the same time. And I've had these moments where you just go into an almost pure vibratory state, the stateless state. There is no body, there is no anything. You're just like vibrating. It's pretty cool. And it's really hard to come back to that kind of ceremonial stuff after you experience this, because now it's just like wearing too many clothes. Like, it's just too much. And honestly, like, and this is kind of an unpopular opinion, it's mine though, I think that all of the harder you're working at magic, the more you're actually signaling subconscious self-loathing to yourself. You are subconsciously telling yourself, I have to work hard to get my results. Whereas I believe that magic is actually easy. It is 100% natural. It is accessible to everyone all the time, because it's essentially what we're made of. And so like adding all these extra layers, it's really just kind of you telling yourself that you don't deserve whatever it is you're trying to get. And I don't go that way.
I like that. I like that. That's spot on. It's interesting because I had a realization a few years ago, which I think kind of echoes this, where I was like, I was really trying hard at stuff. And then finally I was like, I'm going to just go with the current. I'm just going to relax and flow and stop. And that's when things got a lot easier. And,
Yeah.
because when when you're, it was fundamentally an understanding too about the nature of power, that the more you try to grab power and hold on to it, the more power actually controls you, but that when you let go of the need to control, then at that point you and power can get along just fine.
Yeah. Um, I agree 100%. I just, I think that all of this stuff is accessible to everyone. And one of my hyper fixations with like my clients and stuff is how radical self-love can be for transformation and having
Mm-hmm.
access to this magical power. Because when you love yourself, like, and I mean truly, not in that like, inspirational meme kind of way. I mean, really and truly, like, love yourself on a vibratory level. Like, it is impossible to fail. It is almost impossible to truly suffer. It's not that you won't have your emotions anymore, but suddenly, like, you are a part of the fabric of the universe. How could how can you suffer on the same level as when you feel separate? And so I don't know. I found that type of inner love and inner calm to be really revolutionary and very difficult to find. And part of my objection to a lot of traditional culture is that it it again, like, kind of prescribes the opposite. It's always telling you that you're either over or under. You're either
Yeah.
over something, lording power over it, or you are underneath it trying to get it. And that is the opposite of being. And so,
Yeah. I 100% am with you on that. And it ends up creating it's interesting because it also ends up creating these interesting power dynamics, these social behaviors you see on the web a lot of the time, where people are basically engaged in the very same behavior in their interactions with each other. And then you have these little troll fests where they're like, like one person takes a dig at another person, and it's like, well, okay, like where's this really getting us anyway?
I mean, I agree. I'm also an avid shit poster, but yes. But
But
to
there's a
me,
difference when you do it for fun and you're doing it because your
right,
ego is so wrapped up into it. Like you
somebody
have
hurt
to
your
be
feelings.
right. Because
Oh my God.
I've
Yeah.
seen you post sometimes, and sometimes you even responded to some of my stuff, and I know it's like, oh, she's having fun with me, and I'm like, that's cool. I'll totally go with it, because you know what, I need it. I need a little perspective, and that's fine. I take myself too seriously sometimes, so it's a good thing. But a lot of people won't, because they'll get their ego wrapped up into it. But there's a real difference between shit posting because you're in an egotistical place, and shit posting because you're like, you know what, I actually want to help this person and they desperately need a laugh.
And for me, it has a lot to do with what time of day it is. Like, if I am posting or responding to anything before 10 o'clock in the morning, like, just don't pay any attention to me. I'm just being, I'm being awful. But yeah, I don't know. Occult circles in particular are so ripe for poking and prodding and playing, and some people really get a chapped ass about it. But that's okay. Um, it's all in fun. And also because I actually genuinely care. Like, that's the thing that also drives me, is like, I'm not always sure that I like people, but I love them and I want them to feel better. And I get really irritable and frustrated at times when I'm like, why are you clinging to this thing that is clearly not making you feel good? And then you're telling me that I am an idiot because I am not clinging to the thing when I feel great. So I don't really know. Like, that is where I bump my head up a lot.
Well, and I think that's interesting, because then you kind of have to question, like, why is this person so invested in being miserable? What is the joy of that? But clearly there's something there.
Yeah, I really don't know. I mean, this is the thing that kind of like makes my head spin all the time, because I'm like, why doesn't everybody want to feel better? Like, why don't they want to? Or maybe they think that they want to, but they got off track somewhere. And so they just keep trying the same thing over and over and over again. And again, like, especially within like chaos magic practices, like these are people who will beat their head against the wall doing the same thing over and over and wonder why. Like it's built into the title, like chaos magic. Why is my life a mess? Well, gee, words have power, and you're surrounding yourself with a very particular type of energy. Every single person I know who has devoted themselves to a chaos god in particular has ended up homeless at least once. And it's almost like there's no, like, in their minds, like, correlation. It's really weird. Like, spirits are real. But no, none of this has anything to do with my current circumstance. And I'm just like, are we on board with this or not?
Are we too busy beating off our head or not? When you said beating on the head, I just was like, oh, I'm gonna take that in because it's so funny. Because you were like, how many times, like the wank and sigil method, right?
Oh yeah.
One
Oh yeah,
form or
that's like
another.
my favorite. I My husband actually told there's like a formal word for it. And I was like, of course you know that. Of course you do. Because he's all into like the historical aspect of the occult. Whereas I'm like running around with my magnet, swiping my head and doing weird stuff. But yeah, I did a whole episode on sigils recently and very expressly said, I think in my flyer, like no jizz required.
I love it.
Without that, it's fine. So, one of the things that I found really interesting about your work, and again, that was influential on me, is your work with pop culture entities and icons. And it's because I think that you really understand where I'm coming from with the idea of like we create these entities, because isn't that the basis of what you're talking about with pop culture magic?
It is. I mean, I would say I would add to that a slight twist to it, which is that it may not even be that we're creating, that we're discovering them,
Mm,
and that they're discovering us, and that there's an act of creation between the two, that they're creating
oh,
us even as we're creating them.
well, that's really interesting. So almost like the entity has to, well, I guess that would make sense. Like if we're creating form, but they're doing the inspiration, like almost inserting themselves into somebody's brain at the right time so that they can be born
Yeah,
here.
yeah, because like look at the act of a writer, like as an example here. And I mean, I write fiction as well as nonfiction. My characters, for them to come to life, at some point there has to be a thing where they're discovering me as much as I'm discovering them, where we're co-creating each other. They're co-creating the story that I'm developing, but in part they're doing it because they're discovering me at the same time as I'm discovering them. And if you look at pop culture in general, it's and really even just ancient mythology, it's the same thing. Like, okay, there's thunder up in the sky. Well, Zeus is throwing thunderbolts around. Well, how do people come up with that? In a certain very realistic way, I think that, it wasn't just this is an explanation for why things are. It was a co-discovery where it was like, okay, here's this thing happening, and we're discovering this thing and we're coming up with an explanation of it, but this thing is coming up with an explanation for us as well. And so
Right.
then you tap into the mythopoetic, which is really what pop culture is. It's modern mythopoesis, where we're simultaneously creating and being created by the pop culture. And we see this because we see how pop culture then spreads outward like a virus, like like the entities, and it becomes its own thing. And you have these people who have like they're in jokes about it. Like, if you watch What We Do in the Shadows, it's a good example. Anyone who watches that knows that show spreads itself through that, because then people are like, oh, I want to find out like what they're talking about when they're talking about the vampire council or the energy vampire or whatever. And they start exploring it, and so it comes alive in their mind. But at the same time, as it comes alive in their mind, we're making it come alive out there, and we're manifesting it. So there's a very real sense of continual interaction occurring.
Yeah, that's how I perceive it as well. Like this constant interplay between the material and the ephemeral in a relationship all the time. And I guess like, yeah, that's why I think it's important to be really vigilant about your relationships with the entities that that are there because they are real. Just because they don't have bodies doesn't mean that they don't exist or have their own agendas or their own, perspectives or desires or all the things that we experience.
Well, and I mean, I would even throw out there, look at the examples of pop culture where you have, for example, actors playing characters. At that point, the actors become avatars for those characters. And so those characters end up having a physical existence here. And in some cases, that physical existence can be taken way too far. I mean, I think of Heath Ledger as the Joker, for example, where that certainly that interaction with the Joker as a primal force of chaos certainly had a role in his subsequent death, because of just the nature of playing such a chaotic being. Because the Joker, when you interact with the Joker is ultimately a force of chaos, but the Joker doesn't care. The Joker is out there to have fun and everything else. And if you get killed along the way, well, hey, that'll just give it another laugh, because that's the nature of its power. It's a very tricksterish, chaotic force. It's why I wouldn't work with the Joker. I mean, I find the character fascinating, but I would never work with the Joker for that
Right.
reason.
That entity will continue to exist with or without your particular body.
Right.
So your body is disposable. I'm one of the things that I'm weirdly fascinated by is that there's this rise in a subculture on TikTok for people that claim that they have dissociative identity disorder.
Mhm.
And they set up these entire, and they're called systems, like these elaborate, multi-character things. And there's a lot of controversy about whether or not it's real or not. And I believe that it both is and is not. I do not think it's actually the way that they're presenting it as a mental disorder, but the fact that it exists as a reflection of viral culture, because this came up because of TikTok. They're all influencing each other and creating a collective, almost like psychosis.
Mhm.
But it's also a form of like willing possession, because at a certain point, these altars are real in some context and they are occupying that space, even if it's only because you decided to create them or allow them into your space. And so to me, it's just absolutely fascinating because, like you said about being an actor and taking on a role, like this would be like taking on multiple roles. And you have to kind of wonder what that would do to the mechanical form, your material form, and what that would do to you like long term. Like how many entities can you carry in a body? I
Well,
don't
I
know.
mean, yeah, that's an interesting question, because you also have to consider the energetic structures of the body and how those structures might need to be changed in order to allow for that. Because the body, in a very real sense, the human body, in a very real sense, has specific structures in place, physically, of course, but also energetically. So if you're going to start bringing other things in, you're overloading your system. I mean, you look at something. We use fibromyalgia as an example. I find it really fascinating because, people will talk about this. You look at that, and well, from what I can tell, and this is because I do some spiritual work and healing on people too. From what I can tell, it's basically an overexcitation of the energetic system. They have too much energy, and what has happened is they haven't learned how to regulate it, or their circuits have gotten so damaged and their nerves are basically so exhausted, and they haven't learned how to let go. And there's such a thing as having too much energy and not learning how to let it go and relax and release. Well, the same thing can be said of entities and spirits. I would say, just because I've done full-on possessions with spirits, where I've had spirits fully possess me, that you have to be very careful when you work in that capacity, because afterwards you will be very tired. It was interesting because I did a working recently with a fellow magical practitioner, and this person hadn't really believed me fully about the nature of possessions. It was kind of like, well, are you just putting on a show? It seems very dramatic, etc. And I'm like, no, like, you need to understand this is really happening. There is an effect. Me feeling tired and exhausted afterwards is not a show. It's not something I particularly enjoy. And then we did another working, and they got an experience of it. And afterwards they were kind of like, it wasn't the same type of experience, but it was enough. They were like, oh, there really is something to this. And I'm like, yes, there is. So you ought to be careful what you're getting into, because you just don't know. But once you do know, you discover, well, hey, there's certain limitations here and we can change and modify them, but we better know what we're getting into even with that, because it gets real interesting.
Yeah. And I think that it would be remiss of us to talk about the mechanics of magic without touching on the mechanics of physicality, which is that, when you do start playing with these things in a much more directed and focused kind of way, like, you do have to be very conscious of the limitations of your body. I mean, this is really how I got screwed up. Was I was moving, I went to, after I had my traumatic thing, I got the bright idea to go to yoga school, and we were doing like 5 hours of yoga a day. I was moving way too much energy around an already pretty sensitive system, and it got lodged in the top of my head. And I ended up with, like, a big blood clot and a headache for a year. And it was 100% the result of this magical activity. And the repercussions of that can be quite long lasting. Even certain yogis, like I believe it was Vivekananda, who went into meditation and dropped dead because he just didn't need his body anymore. Like, thank you, we're done. And so, it's so boring, but if you're going to get into this kind of practice, you really do need to, like, eat right, exercise, get enough sleep, like, take care of yourself, stay hydrated, which is another reason why, like, the chaos magic model never really worked for me, because a lot of that seems to draw people that have substance abuse problems and different types of, self-abusive behaviors. And you can't really be a highly competent and highly functional magic practitioner if you are wildly unhealthy.
No, you can't. I mean, I agree with that. I mean, I live what would be considered a fairly healthy lifestyle as a result of my own realizations around that. And it's true, you have to be careful, like with the work that you did. There was a point where I was doing some fire meditation Taoist techniques. So there's a couple different schools for people who are watching this. There's fire and water. I do the water method now. But the fire method is much more excitatory. And I ended up getting what would be called ki sickness or chi sickness, where I basically ended up burning myself out. Fortunately, I realized it pretty quickly and I stopped. And then I just went back to the water breathing meditation and relaxed and released, and I got myself back. It took me a couple months though. It wasn't like I could the damage happened like that. I couldn't undo the damage like that. And that's a good warning right there. I want to add to that though, just another thought too, because we talk about the physicality, that one thing I always find interesting, and I had this the other day. I had a person email me and they're like, I want to make money and the tactics that you're sharing don't work. And I'm like, well, what do you want to make money for? What do you want that money for? Well, I want to have a stable lifestyle so I can practice more spiritual stuff. Well, what are you doing to get that stable lifestyle? Well, if I got like even a good job, then I'm like, then go out and get a good job. Do some magic around it, but go out and fill out applications and apply for, get interviews and all that other stuff. Do the mundane actions that you need to do in order to get the magic to work. People sometimes have this notion of, well, if I do magic, it'll bring this to the door. And it's like, I'm not saying it doesn't ever happen, because I mean, I've had some pretty amazing stuff happen that way, like getting the place that I'm living in now. Like I got that in a overly saturated market. I got that in half a week. Like it was, otherwise it would have taken forever. But yes, I did some magic around it and it was very impressive and pulled it off, but I still had to apply for the place. I had to do something of the mundane in order to get the magic to work.
Yeah. You have to actually put yourself out there and, like, I always tell clients, like, all I'm doing is opening windows and doors for you. You have to actually go through them. I can't do the whole thing for you. And that's true in my own practice. I can do my favorite wealth magic, which is mostly just a shimmy, like, hello, money. But still,
I like that shimmy.
but I still have to put myself out there. I still have to, like, promote my business. I still have to see clients. I still have to do things. It doesn't just suddenly rain dollar bills from my ceiling. You have to
You
take
still have to
action.
shimmy.
Yeah.
But that money, you want that money, you got to shake that money maker.
That's right. Yes, that's actually for real my favorite abundance magic spell. People think I'm kidding because it comes up in witchcraft groups all the time. Like, I need money real fast. What do I do? And I'm like, honey, just like go and like shake your titties and say money, money, money. Like abundance loves joy. It really does. And so if you get yourself up there in that like higher vibrational good mood and you start thinking like, well, I deserve pretty things, boom, they start falling out of the sky a little bit more easily. But you still got to go out. You still have to leave your house. You
That's
still have to.
right. You still got to put yourself out there and take a chance.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on to the show. This has been a fascinating and fun topic, and I'm definitely going to have you back again later on down the line because I think that we need some more Rich Kiska action here. So just remind us again where we can find you online.
Okay, you can find me on Facebook under Rich Kiska. I have both my personal profile and a business profile. And you can go to my website, deepintheheartofhexes.com.
All right. And any final thoughts you want to share with us before we wrap up here?
Not in particular. I think we covered a lot of ground. This was so much fun. Thank you so much for having me. And I would absolutely love to come back.
Great. Well, it was a lot of fun for me. I love covering large parts of ground and things like that. You know, we both are very extensive thinkers. We go out there and it is fun. And I definitely will have you back.
Okay,
All right.
wonderful.
All right, folks. So that is the end of this particular interview, but there will be more coming. And in the meantime, stay magical.